Dr. Leslie Brandt from the USDA Forestry Department.
Forest Service.
Forest Service. Talking about the urban forests and climate change.
Thank you. My name's Leslie Brandt. As Harold said, I'm the Forest Service. I'm with the Office of Sustainability and Climate, where we work to help integrate information about climate change, carbon management, and sustainability into the work that we do as an agency. So the Forest Service is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but it is the only land management agency within USDA. So a lot of folks think that the Forest Service is part of the Department of Interior, like the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife Service, but we're actually part of USDA. We have a long history with that agency. So I'm going to be talking about climate change impacts on urban forests. So first of all, urban forests provide a number of different benefits to our communities. So they help improve air quality, provide cooling and shade, reduce heating and cooling energy use. There's a lot of research recently that has shown that urban forests can provide mental health benefits as well as physical health benefits to communities. They help control stormwater, provide cooling and shade, and support biodiversity. So lots of really great benefits, but they are also at risk. So what we have noticed is that temperatures are rising globally due to fossil fuel emissions, and the Twin Cities here is no stranger to this. And so we have seen an increase in average temperature in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of about 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since the historical records have begun. So back in about the late 1800s, we've started recording these temperatures and seen a steady increase. Now you'll see that there's a lot of year-to-year variation as well, but overall we're seeing more hot years, and this doesn't even include 2023, which would be even higher, and fewer of these really cool years. It's also getting wetter here in the Twin Cities. So we have had fewer extremely dry years and more extremely wet years in the past couple of decades. And that doesn't mean that it's always wet all year round, but rather we've also seen an increase in heavy rain events, and so we'll have periods of dryness in between these very heavy rain events. So rain events where you have 1 or 2 inches within a 24-hour period have been increasing.
Dr. Brandt?
Yeah.
Is it a good time to ask a question? Or
Sure, go ahead.
So why does climate change impact the amount of water that comes in a rain event? I don't ever understand that.
Yeah, so it's a complicated question to answer because a lot of the precipitation patterns are driven by local climatic patterns, and so what we've actually seen is in the Midwest, we have an increase in storm events because of the way that the continental movement of large weather systems go across from west to east, but then also from the Gulf Coast, and how those things interact has been changing. And so some of the research recently is showing that we're getting more of these conditions that favor these thunderstorms and other rain events in the summer. And so that's not universally true across everywhere in the United States even. So out west, we're not necessarily seeing this pattern, where we're actually seeing an increase in dryness year-round and more wildfires and things like that. But here in the Midwest, because of these weather patterns that cause these thunderstorm events in the summer, that's what is leading to the those increases in heavy rain events. So urban forests are also experiencing effects from these increases in temperature and precipitation. So like I said, just because it's getting wetter overall, we're also seeing periods of extreme drought as well, like we saw last summer. And so those are dramatically affecting our urban forests. We're also on the converse side seeing an increase in flooding as well from these heavy rain events, as well as from lots of winter precipitation. So we're seeing increases in winter precipitation compared to summer and fall. And so when that snow melt occurs, we're seeing a lot of flooding happening along the Mississippi River, for example. With those heavy rain events, we're also seeing an increase in wind-related damage. And then we're seeing increases in pest and disease outbreaks as well, and some of those are related to climate change. So for example, bur oak blight, which affects bur oak trees, is actually something that has been increasing because of increases in wetness during the spring. And so we're seeing an increase in that disease because of increases in spring precipitation. Other pests can affect stress trees. So when you have initial drought effects or wind damage, then other pests can opportunistically come in and further damage the trees. And then we also have things like emerald ash borer, where there's not really a direct relationship with climate change, but the additive effect of emerald ash borer plus the effects of climate change are really having a dramatic effect on our urban forests. And so we're really seeing a lot of this stuff coming up in the news. So climate change is really affecting our urban forests from here in the Twin Cities to out east to out west, where you're in the wildland-urban interface, and we're seeing a lot of increases in wildfire because of the combination of increased drought as well as effects from beetle kill and long-term lack of management in certain areas. So with those changes in temperature, we are also seeing and are expected to see changes in hardiness zones. And so if you are a gardener, you're probably familiar with hardiness zones. This determines like which plants you can plant where. We are now in the Twin Cities due to updates based on changes in temperature and also increased data availability. We are now Zone 5 in the Twin Cities, and we used to be Zone 4. And so part of that is from that urban heat island effect that we have here in the cities, where lots of impervious surfaces will absorb solar radiation. We also have waste heat from our vehicles and buildings that also create heat, and then changes in kind of canopy cover can also affect local temperatures as well. And what we're expected to see is that over the next several decades, that those hardiness zones are going to shift even more. So hardiness zones are determined by the lowest temperature experienced in the winter. And so right now, we're in Zone 5A, which means that on average our lowest temperatures experienced in the winter are between -20 and -15 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we expect to see is that by the end of the century, we could be up to a Zone 7A, which means that our lowest temperatures are just going to be around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That's more similar to like southern Illinois or Tennessee or Missouri. So very different conditions that could allow a lot of trees to survive that wouldn't have been able to before. Now, I'm showing two different scenarios here. One is under a low emission scenario. That would be if we dramatically reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. And then this high emission scenario would be if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at a similar rate to what has happened previously. Although we're now at a reduced rate from what that trajectory was. And so it might not be quite as bad as under this high emission scenario right now. But overall, we expect those hardiness zones to shift. So we have used this information to develop tree species planting lists and other information for urban foresters. There's information on the website forestadaptation.org, and if you go to the urban focus area, you'll find all these little dots you can click on and get information for your community. So we do have information for the Twin Cities. So that includes these climate-informed species lists, and I don't expect you to read all of this right now, but I'm just showing you what this looks like. And so it shows what the current and projected hardiness zones as well as heat zones, which are determined by the average warm periods in the summer, so the number of days above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is evaluating commonly planted tree species in the Twin Cities based on inventories from Minneapolis and St. Paul and other areas. And it gives urban foresters or community members an idea of which species might be more vulnerable or adaptable to future climate conditions. So I'm just going to walk through a few of those examples for you. So one tree species that you might not be as familiar with that was found to be pretty adaptable to current and future conditions is the yellowwood. This is a species that is currently native to Tennessee. It probably was more widespread before the last ice age, but it has these big seed pods that require a large mammal to digest them and deposit their seeds. And so they haven't been able to kind of re-establish after the last ice age. And so this is the one species, it's in the legume family that tolerates a wide range of conditions from dry to wet, and that's really important given what I was telling you about how we're seeing both increases in drought and increases in precipitation. Another adaptable tree is the Kentucky coffee tree, and this is another one that has these big seed pods that was probably here in Minnesota, and there's some evidence that suggests that over the paleo record it was present in Minnesota, but is not currently native to Minnesota, but it's been planted pretty extensively in the Twin Cities now and is doing very well. And again, it tolerates a wide range of conditions, which allows it to persist. Bald cypress is another one. So this is a species that you would normally see in these big swamps in the south, and they have these really cool little leaves that come out in the water. These are very extremely flood tolerant. They are a conifer, but they lose their needles during the winter, so they are a deciduous conifer. And this is another species that can tolerate a wide range of conditions and temperatures as well. And then ironwood, this is another species that tolerates a wide range of site conditions, is very drought tolerant as well as disease resistant. This is native to Minnesota and found in a lot of our forests. I don't know what that was.
Somebody dropped something upstairs.
Okay.
Mic drop. Yeah, I was getting excited.
Sometimes this will do that.
Yeah. So this is another one that it's not, all of these species are currently not overly planted, and so there are things that would be good to increase more in our planting palette because of that. Another one is called the musclewood, or it's also called the American hornbeam or blue beech. These are very tolerant of a wide range of growing conditions, also really not commonly planted here in the Twin Cities.
Are there any that are good that we already have in the Twin Cities, or are you gonna talk about that next? I mean, that are considered durable and adaptable?
Yeah, well, so a lot of the oak species that are currently planted are very adaptable. Maples are a lot of the maples are adaptable. Not sugar maple is one that's more vulnerable, but silver maple, red maple, those are more tolerant of a wide range of conditions. But the problem is that about 40% of the tree canopy right now is maple, and so if you get a pest that comes through, it could wipe everything out.
So is 40% of all maples or are they all, you listed off like 4 to 5 varieties of maples, so are they?
So what we want to do is increase our genetic diversity and taxonomic diversity, and I'll show some things about biodiversity in a minute, but we're really putting ourselves at risk, even if you do different species within the same family, because a lot of the pests and diseases will attack an entire family of trees. And so even if one maple is okay and another maple maybe not so much, not as widely planted, we still have an overabundance of maples in our tree canopy right now. So a lot of urban foresters are really recommending that we look at alternative tree species that are not in the maple family. So a couple of the species that we found that are more vulnerable to changes in climate that are found here, one is white pine. This is also not a super urban tolerant tree. This is something you would find more prominently in the north woods. It has a lot of pest and disease issues as well. Gray birch, this is not a super commonly planted tree, but it is to some extent, so this is different from paper birch. Paper birch also is vulnerable as well, but this gray birch has a very narrow habitat requirement, so it's really on that highly vulnerable list. But paper birch as well is one that's not likely to do well in this area. So some caveats here, just because something is labeled as adaptable doesn't mean it's adaptable everywhere, doesn't mean we should go and plant it everywhere. There's always, you have to consider the right tree for the right place. And then if we only plant the most adaptable trees, then we also put ourselves at risk for the reasons I was just saying about how we also want to ensure that we have a lot of biodiversity as well. And trees that are vulnerable doesn't mean that you, that they're not adapted to any location in Minnesota. They might be adapted to other locations in northern Minnesota, and those vulnerable trees, it's not like we need to like remove them tomorrow, but rather they may require additional care. So one of the things that we did was looked at the species composition across the Twin Cities, and so this map is showing GIS points of all of the different trees inventoried in the Twin Cities. So this comes from different street tree inventories as well as park inventories. Minneapolis is outlined in yellow. And what I just said here, this is the number of maple trees compared to other genera of species that are commonly planted in the Twin Cities. So maple is by far our most common genus of tree in the Twin Cities, followed by ash, although those are decreasing because of emerald ash borer. And then oaks is the third. Other commonly planted genera include basswood or linden, elms, honey locust, hackberry, spruce, birch, and pine. The Dutch elm resistant elms are another really adaptable group of trees, and those are being planted more. They have a pretty wide temperature tolerance range. Honey locust and hackberry are also very adaptable to a lot of different conditions. Basswood or linden, those tend to have more moisture requirements, and so they might be more vulnerable in the case of a drought, for example. And a lot of the oak species are very drought tolerant. But
Good question for you.
Mhm.
When you talk about tree inventory, are you including all residential trees?
No,
Or just the public ones?
These are just mostly public.
Okay.
So we don't have a lot of data on private residential trees right now. The Forest Service is doing what is called the Urban Forest Inventory and Analysis program that was just started a few years ago. And they have inventoried the Twin Cities, and they've done these like sample plots that include private trees, private lands as well. And so that data is still being processed, but we should have that information soon, but it's only gonna be a sample, so it's not gonna give you the exact inventory of everything that's in the tree canopy. And so we use this information to help understand the biodiversity. So biodiversity can be calculated in a number of ways. So on the left, that's just species richness, or just the number of different species. On the right, this is a diversity index that also takes into account the abundance of the different species. And so those areas that are darker are the ones that have higher biodiversity. And Minneapolis is a community that's really focused on planting a wide diversity of tree species in their canopy, and you will see that they have a much higher biodiversity in their tree canopy than a lot of the other areas. And then the other thing that we did was we looked at combining information about where there might be more vulnerable trees and where there might be higher social vulnerability due to low income or people who are racially disenfranchised or have more people with disabilities. So that's all combined, and so those areas where that are in red are areas that at least a third of the inventory trees are considered moderately or highly vulnerable to climate change under a high emissions scenario. And then we did, I don't think I showed this, but we also did this analysis to overlay, and I added this to my slide deck that's in this other version, but we overlaid this to find areas where we had high tree vulnerability and high social vulnerability, which would help us understand where we might want to put more effort into our tree planting, for example.
Dr. Brandt, we have the plans in place, or work being developed by Met Council to put in an extended light rail system along our major highway that goes through here, 81, which has a lot of trees that are bordering a lake area. And I just wonder, how do you work with Met Council planners? Does the urban forest, research people work with the Met Council about their environmental impact that they're required to do by federal law whenever they use federal money to put in transit? And I just wonder, where do you guys connect with those people?
So me personally, so I work at a very high level nationally, and so I'm not working just with the Twin Cities area, but also nationally. So what I work on a lot is trying to figure out how to integrate climate change considerations into all of our environmental impact statements and environmental analyses that are required by the federal government. And provide information for folks on understanding local climate change impacts as well. We don't have the capacity to work directly with every community on their individual planning efforts. But I'm also part of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Long-Term Ecological Research Program that is out of the University of Minnesota. And there's been a lot of efforts to work with Met Council through that program to share information. I've also been involved in a couple of other conversations with Met Council about using this information and other information about tree canopy to help inform their decision-making processes. So there's definitely been information sharing back and forth, but I'm not like working directly with them on any particular project. So this information I've shared with you is all about kind of how climate change is going to affect our urban trees, but we also want to understand what we can do and what actions we can take to reduce risks to our urban forests. And so in collaboration with the organization American Forests and the University of Washington, and then my former organization, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, we developed this Climate and Health Action Guide. And that includes a climate and health menu, and this is a peer-reviewed list of strategies that folks can use to adapt their urban forest to climate change and also help support human health and carbon sequestration as well. And it's called a menu because you're allowed to kind of pick and choose the types of strategies that you might take depending on what your values are or what you're trying to achieve. And so these are organized into some very broad strategies. This includes engaging social systems to integrate climate change, urban forests, and human health actions. And so trying to get folks to do the work of integrating those social considerations with urban forest considerations and health considerations and bringing those all together. And using the impact of human health threats and stressors information to use urban forests and trees to help reduce those risks. So we can plant urban forests to help reduce the amount of air pollution. We can also use them to provide shade and local cooling. But then we also need to consider, like there are a lot of trees that produce allergens and and they produce air pollutants as well, some of them do. And so making very conscious decisions about tree planting to provide the best care for people in different populations is something that's part of that strategy. The third is to maintain or increase the extent of urban forests and vegetative cover. So not a no-brainer here, but a strong, healthy urban canopy helps reduce the urban heat island effect, can help control stormwater, also provides carbon benefits to help absorb those the carbon in the air. And so all of that can be beneficial to communities, but we always want to make those decisions with the community in mind to make sure that the species that we're choosing are things that they want in their community, that the people actually want trees. So there's concerns about, gentrification as being an issue where increasing urban tree canopy can cause home prices to go up, and then people can be pushed out of their neighborhoods. And so not everybody wants urban trees. And so I think that conversation needs to happen a lot before you go ahead and do that as well. And then these strategies are about reducing the impacts of climate change to our urban forests. So sustaining and restoring ecological functions, reducing the impacts of physical and biological stressors, and enhancing taxonomic, functional, and structural diversity. And then finally, this one also is about reducing the impacts of climate change, but this is where we might alter ecosystems towards new and expected conditions. So maybe we no longer can sustain a forest in some area and we need to convert it to a prairie. Or perhaps an area is experiencing a lot of flooding and we want to convert it to a floodplain forest and plant more flood-tolerant trees. And then the final two strategies are really about using urban trees to promote social well-being and mental health and promote human health co-benefits and climate adaptation activities. So finally, I'm going to walk through an example of how we have used this information in a real-world project here in the Twin Cities, and this is at Crosby Farm Regional Park, which is in the along the Mississippi River in St. Paul. So this is part of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which is managed by the Park Service, but most of the land is actually owned by a mix of ownerships. So the location where we're focusing is where that star is. So Crosby Farm Regional Park is the largest natural park in the St. Paul system of parks. It's got 736 acres. It is mostly a natural park, and it's important for protecting and maintaining biodiversity. Most of that is a floodplain forest, which means that it is seasonally flooded. It is right along the banks of the Mississippi River. But there are some other lakes and marshes and some upland woodlands as well. So this study area is right in between the Mississippi River and Crosby Lake here. So this is like West 7th in St. Paul, if you're familiar with that. And then there's 35E right here. And this is also at Bedote, which is an important cultural site for the Dakota people. And so we have been working a lot with the Dakota people on this project as well. So this is the ancestral homelands, and it's important for the Dakota people because this is part of their creation story at this point where the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers meet. And so there's a lot going on in this small area and things that we need to consider. So this project was to assess the effectiveness of different climate adaptation strategies for growth, survival, and phenology, and I'll talk about what that is, of those floodplain forests. And so to do that, we selected a different mix of species along this kind of gradient from trying to maintain what was there, what we're calling a resistance strategy, to facilitating change, which we're calling a transition strategy. And so we're selecting species from these different hardiness zones, so zones 4, 5, and 6. So the resistance strategy is where we're selecting trees from nurseries in zone 4, and these are all species that are native to the site now. So that includes silver maple, American elm, eastern cottonwood, river birch, and hackberry. This area was dominated by green ash and lost a bunch of canopy from emerald ash borer. And so we're not replacing the ash because we don't have EAB resistant ash yet. And then in the resilience treatment, what we're doing is we're adding more biodiversity and more species from hardiness zone 5. And so we're including species that are native to the area as well as some that are nearly native. And so one of those is American sycamore, which is native just south of here, as well as swamp white oak, which had been found in this area. And the records are suggesting that it was very prominent and people harvested it early on when Europeans colonized the area, but it used to be more common in this area. And then the transition treatment, this is trees from hardiness zone 6, and this includes a lot of more southern species. So sweet gum, pin oak, pecan and tulip poplar, in addition to American sycamore. So we planted about 1,000 trees during the pandemic in 2020 in the spring. This was also right around the time of the George Floyd protests. So it was a very tumultuous time, and it felt really good to get together and do something positive and be outside. So it was we had a big group of volunteers that contributed to this effort. And we've been measuring data on growth and survival for the past 4 years, looking at temperature and soil moisture as well, looking at the understory vegetation, and looking at phenology, which is the timing of budding, leaf out, flowering, and leaf fall, as well as fruiting of these different trees. We also, in partnership with Wakan Tipi Iwanya Kapi, which is formerly known as the Lower Failing Creek Project, we developed these signs that are in at Crosby Farm Park. So if you go there and you walk along the path, you will see these signs that talk about the experiment, but then also have an image that was created by a Dakota artist of these different trees. They're showing different seasons as well as the Dakota and Anishinaabe names of these trees. And so it's a way to kind of connect different ways of knowing and cultural along with Western knowledge. So we have 2023 data right now, but we haven't analyzed that yet. But we've been looking at percent survival under these different treatments, and what we would expect to see is that in the beginning, that more of this resistance treatment would be more successful, and that as things get warmer, we would expect this transition treatment that had the more warm adapted trees would become better survivors and have better growth. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So right in the first couple of years, those resistance and resilience treatments were the most successful. We had some issues with the nursery stock from the transition treatment, because we're bringing trees from nurseries in like Tennessee up here, and some of them didn't leave out the first year, but they did the second year, so that's why there's actually more survivors in the second year than the first year. We call them our zombie trees. But over time, we're going to be collecting this information for a couple of decades, and to see whether our hypothesis is true, whether that moving those more warm adapted trees is actually going to be more beneficial in the long run. And if you're interested in getting involved with this project, you can volunteer with the Mississippi Park Connection, which is the Friends group associated with the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, and it's called the Crosby Crew. And so they do things like collect data, and they also help maintain the plots and do some outreach events as well. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have, and go into more depth on any particular topic of interest.
Fascinating and very high level, as you mentioned, but also love to see the local level. So even bringing it down even closer locally to us, our church has like 4 ash trees that are being sustained, given life support with the I don't know how frequently the shots they get. And so what does a church do when those trees are no longer going to survive? And how do we replace those trees with something? Who do we go to find out which trees have adaptability, meet some of those things that we really want because we love the shade for our outside worship space? So so how do we keep all those pieces of great big ideas and bring it down into the, how do we do this?
Yeah. So, so if you continue to treat your ash trees, they might be with you for quite a long time. you have to keep up with them because what I've noticed in St. Paul, they were treating the street trees, and then they got behind on it due to funding issues, and then Emerald Ash Borer came in, and then now they have to remove them. But as long as you keep up with the treatment every couple of years, those trees should be able to survive. Now, ash trees don't live forever either. As they get older, they will start breaking due to wind events and things like that. So that's something I've noticed too, is that big storm events, you will often get big branch breakage with ash trees. They're fast growers, but they don't have as dense of wood as, say, like an oak tree, so they're more susceptible to breakage than some of the other species, and they don't live as long as like an oak would, for example. So once you're thinking long-term about replacing your trees, something to think about is biodiversity. So instead of having if you plan replacing it with 4 new trees, pick things that are completely unrelated to one another. So some of the things that I suggested earlier are some of the trees that are not as heavily planted in the area that are likely to be adaptable. So like yellowwood, Kentucky coffee tree, ironwood, and the musclewood are all things that they're not related to each other, and they also are not related to a lot of the things that are heavily planted in the area. So those are some things to think about. The other things to think about are other values that you care about with your urban trees. So do you want something that might produce fruit? Where are you interested in having urban foraging happening in your area, where you might have apples or plums or something like that, where people, the community could use that food. Aesthetics as well, so there's a lot of flowering trees that don't get as big, but a lot of people like them because they're pretty. But if you're looking to produce a lot of shade, you're gonna pick a different suite of tree species as well. So thinking about canopy cover, like if you want a really large tree that provides a lot of shade versus something that is more ornamental is another consideration as well. As far as like who to talk to, I would get a certified arborist to come out. So if you go on the International Society of Arboriculture website, you will be able to find a list of ISA certified arborists in the area. There's a number of different tree care companies in the area that have ISA certified arborists, but having somebody come out and consult and provide a very targeted set of recommendations based on the specifics of your site is going to be really important, because even I gave you some generalizations about which species might be more adaptable, but it's going to depend on the specific soil types, the amount of space that you have, whether you're trying to shoot for a large shade tree or a smaller ornamental tree, and some of the other considerations. Also thinking about what else is around you as well. So if you have an overabundance of a certain species in the neighborhood, you might want to select something that's different. So an arborist can help you with all of that. So that's what I would recommend doing. And then making sure that the tree is properly planted when it is planted, because what we notice is that a lot of homeowners, when they plant their own trees, don't plant the trees too deep. So you've got to make sure that you see the root flare on the base of the trunk, and that needs to be sticking up out of the soil. And making sure that if you buy like a containerized tree that's like in a pot, that the roots are not wrapped around each other because they'll actually girdle around the tree and eventually strangle the tree. So you gotta make sure that you kind of cut and let out all of those roots to make sure that they can grow and that there's enough space for them to grow. The other thing that I have seen with a lot of newly planted trees is a lot of them die because people don't water them. People think that trees don't need to be watered, and they do quite extensively when they're getting newly established. So there are these gator bags that are available that you can get that just attach to the tree and fill it with water and it slowly lets out water. So that's probably the easiest solution to making sure that the tree is continuously watered. Trying to think of other recommendations I would have. Mulching. So mulching is important, but you want to mulch like a donut and not a volcano. So a lot of people will mulch up to the trunk and make kind of like a volcano around their trunk, but that is bad because it can create areas for fungal growth and rot, like right around the trunk. So what you want to do is kind of create a donut of mulch around the tree, so that still allows you to soak up water and provide organic matter, nutrients to the tree, but it's not gonna cause rot along the trunk. Yeah.
For watering trees, I'm given to understand that the feeder roots go out as far as the diameter of the canopy. Is that still?
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So yes, as the tree grows, so those gator bags are great for really young saplings, but as the tree grows, you do want to water out to the edge of where the tree canopy lies. And there are some good. You have an extension, University of Minnesota Extension has a lot of good information on tree care that I would recommend.
What about trees and pollinators? That's the big thing now.
Yeah, so a lot of those flowering trees, the more ornamental trees, are great pollinator habitat. But some of the larger shade trees also can be good pollinator habitat. So basswood or linden, for example, a lot of pollinators really like those. So there are wind pollinated trees, and then there are bee and other insect pollinated trees. So I would say picking insect pollinated trees can be helpful for pollinators, and it also reduces allergens. So things like elms and ashes are wind pollinated, and so the pollen is spread through the air instead of via an insect, and so they can be more allergenic. So insect pollinated trees is a good route to go as well. A lot of people are worried about native versus non-native trees and supporting insect populations. There is some limited research that shows that some like native oak trees, for example, can support a very wide variety of insects, but that there's not a lot of research on that, and in general what I would recommend is focusing more on other aspects of making sure that the tree is adapted to the site, it's providing the benefits that you want, and that you're increasing your biodiversity. If you focus only on hyper-native tree species, there are very few species that are both urban tolerant and native specifically to here, and then you're putting yourself at risk. So that's something I would caution against, to getting overly excited about natives, especially in a very urbanized area. When we're talking about natural systems, that's a different story, but if you're talking about planting trees in a parking lot, it's already highly altered, so we have to consider other factors.
I'm wondering too if, I don't think you touched on this, but I always think of trees as kind of clean the air of pollutants. I mean, leaves do. How effective are they in clearing the air of things that's?
So it really depends on the species, and so some species, and I don't have off the top of my head the data, but there are some species that are really good at filtering the air, and then there are others that actually produce a lot of volatile organic carbons that can react in the atmosphere and create like ozone, for example. And so you've got to be careful and think about that as well. And so generally, you know, those trees that like have a strong smell to them have more of those volatile organic carbons, and not the flowers. I mean, I'm talking about like eucalyptus, for example, you know, like has that strong smell to it, has a lot of volatile organic carbons in it. A lot of oaks have volatile organic carbons as well, and conifers.
I read a report the other day that they're finding the trees are helping with the microplastics in the atmosphere,
Oh.
where they're sticking to the waxy coating on the leaves. And as the leaves fall, it takes the plastics down with it, and it just gets buried in the soil. And this is something relatively new that they found. So as we talk about plastic pollution, trees with waxier leaves would be a benefit, whichever kind those are.
Well, it depends on how you think about it, though. It's like, okay, then you're putting it in the soil, and that's
Yeah.
leaching into our groundwater, and like, so, yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that. But yeah, there's a lot of different considerations, but I would say focusing on biodiversity and not planting more maples would be my like number one take home message right now.
Not planting.
Not don't plant any more maples.
No more maples.
There's plenty of them here already, and if we get a pest that comes through like Asian longhorn beetle, which likes maple, we're kind of duped. So yeah.
Well, we're coming up at 11:30, so
Thank you.
thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.